Section 12. Personal Recollections of Early Melbourne and Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Personal Recollections of Early Melbourne and Victoria by William Westgarth. Section 12. Early Society, Ways, Means and Manners. When rather from our acts we them derive, than our foregoers, all's well that ends well. The salient defect, for more or less interval at first, in all commencing colonial societies, is the disproportion of the female element, and thus, in the sparseness of homes and families, we have that hardness of social feature which illustrates how much better is the one sex with the helpmeet provided in the other. Early Port Phillip was no exception to this rule. Ladies and children were comparatively rare objects. From Tasmania and elsewhere there were a good many choice spirits, in more than one meaning of the words. There was a marvellous consumption of brandy, among such unusual proportions of strong, venturous, rowdy adults, of tea and sugar, and butcher's meat also, giving altogether a statistical category worse than useless for accurate purposes. Manners were rough, to use a mild term. The town was bad, and the bush was worse. When a pious missionary of those early times, prior to adventuring into the interior, inquired of a squatter if the Sabbath were observed in the bush, "Oh yes," was the prompt reply, "a clean shirt and a shave." In such times a large family of ladies might have trodden the soil somewhat as goddesses come down to the desolate habitations of men. Four such families of the earliest times, in particular, rise to my recollection. They were those of Mr. Griles and Mr. Clow, both clergymen, the one of the Anglican, the other of the Presbyterian Communion; of Mrs. Williamson, a widow lady from near Edinburgh; and of Mr. James Smith, magistrate and savings bank manager, whose bustling form, ever hurrying through our streets, was perhaps the best known of the place, and who, along with his friend and co-magistrate, Mr. Simpson, was as the coping stone of local respectability. That all of these fair young maidens, most of them remarkably attractive and pleasing, as I have reason to remember, were duly married, need hardly, under all the circumstances, be told, besides being attested today by whole generations of consequences. Another feature of those early times, a lively and bright feature in many respects, was the considerable number of young men, the younger sons of good families, and, for that matter, the elder sometimes along with the younger, who flocked out, in unusual proportion, I might say, and who infused into the somewhat rough social scene the charm of high culture and manners. Wild they doubtless were in instances not a few, but even that may not be without its cider charm, at least amongst the younger votaries. Some few eventually returned home, mostly those who had been shipwrecked in the troubled sea of early time speculation, but most of them have remained to take their various and full part in colonial society, not a few taking the very highest positions. Thus we had the Stalls and Barrys, the Leslie Fosters, Sladens, Rusdens of town and neighbourhood, and the Campbells, McKnights, Irvines of surrounding squatterdom. Most of these are long since the fathers of families, native Australians, including sons who not unfrequently finished their education in the mother country, a dutiful deference with Australia may surely not yet quarrel with. This habit is still strong, even to the third generation in Victoria, amongst her well-to-do colonists. The youths may not expect better training than from a Hearn or a McCoy, an Irving or a Pearson, on the colonial floor, but such diversion from rule will, in its occasional way, the better help to keep the great scattering family united to their venerable mother, to keep together the elder and the younger Britain. Oxford and Cambridge in particular have, indeed, been quite run upon from Victoria, and those two venerable mothers of English university life can already command in and of that colony quite a small legion of their alumni, the Clarks and the Loden Campbells, the Finlays and Colac Robertsons, the Websters and Westbys and Wilsons, who are now the young or the still vigorous life of their colony. If some few of these have remained permanently at home, or if they pleasantly alternate their domicile by such facile means as the marvels of modern intercommunication afford them, yet all of them help, in more or less degree, to strengthen that tie between the mother and her adventurous colonial offspring, which we must hope is never to be broken. I have the less need to expand further this inspiring section of my subject, seeing that I have been anticipated to some extent by a brother author, who, under the pseudonym of Ralph Boldrewood, has presented to us, in lively and fitting style, a most charming picture of early colonial life, its pleasant hospitalities, plus the Attic salt of no small proportion of the bounteous tables. The disguise of name is not difficult to penetrate. The author's father, residing in his pretty place at Heidelberg, whose genial sun-browned face I pleasantly recall, was well known to me, as well, indeed, as to every other early colonist. His son's book has been my pleasant companion as I write up daily my recollections in the little cabin of the good S.S. Coptic, more especially as we both traversed much the same ground, and during the same interesting early time, in Western Victoria. Government House. Old fashions please me best. I am not so nice to change true rules for odd inventions. Taming of the Shrew. But perfection is never to be expected in human nature, and accordingly some decided drawbacks were, reasonably I think, chargeable to this good society, which, as I have just said, had beneficially helped the dawning colony. There was a tendency to separate from, and rather hold in undue depreciation, the trading and toiling masses who mainly made the country. This tendency was fostered in the pre-representative days, when there were no political institutions to bring the mass of plain but prosperous society to the front. Of course, when these times came, the game was soon up, but, while the preceding era lasted, a somewhat invidious aristocracy gathered around the authorities, the mutual instincts born of the situation inclining them to each other. This united party got the name of Government House. It included most of the highly educated, to whom it was a tempting status, and most of the squatting Crown tenants, whether highly educated or otherwise, and it was cordially open to presentable colonists in general, who, holding its views, of course, a sine qua non, were willing to enter it. The views were decidedly pronounced, and took practically the form of a decided preference for the status quo, or at least modified by the slightest possible of political concession to those noisy, restless masses, who, with the local press generally on their side, ceaselessly kicked at all authority. The political timidity and decision of Mr. Latrobe, worthy man as he otherwise was, gave practically life and soul to this anti-popular party, which laboured more secretly perhaps than openly, to avert or modify, for the time being at least, the political concession expected from the Imperial Parliament. Mr. Latrobe's view evidently was, that if the colonials kicked so strongly when under bonds, how much more furiously must they kick when the bonds were removed. But, as reasonable persons might have predicted, and as was promptly experienced, the colonists kicked because they were bound, and when unbound they did not kick at all. The same political feature, and even more resolute form, had then developed also at Sydney, where Mr. Wentworth led the Upper Ten, for the protection of authority against levelling radicalism. He and his party, out-Heroding Herod, and being more governmental than the government, seriously contemplated a limitation of the franchise to a £50 rental, and the institution of a colonial peerage, as a permanent slap in the face to the ugly democracy. Had he carried his views, or even some considerable approach to them, his influence with the party and his bulldog courage would soon have put his colony into an uproar, and possibly even into civil war. But, thanks for once to his political extremes, the question was happily settled rather by being laughed out of court than by time-wasting argument. Government House, however, did secure, in both colonies, a certain measure of triumph. Authority in esse having the whip hand of authority in posse, the 1/3 of nominees, as against 2/3 elective, were, by a disproportionately large representation purposely given to the squatting districts, converted into a permanent majority of Crown nominees and Crown tenants. This was clearly an evasion of the intention of the Imperial Parliament, which was that, by giving a decided majority to the popular side, the colonies might be graduated into complete constitutionalism. But, after all, this evasion lasted only for a very few years. These early wranglings are now all but forgotten, but they are so only because the narrow views which gave them birth have been entirely defeated, and are all but exploded. In the progress of the colonies since, the merits have occupied the front, and the useful has taken the precedence of the ornamental. The latter is not to be despised when in company with the former, nor has it been, for not a few who were once on the anti-popular side have entered public life, and even secured the highest prizes. This necessitated a descent from cloudland to the solid ground of colonial society. The alternative was extinction, and wisely, in most cases, the latter was not preferred. Another feature of this Sydney ultra party, a curious feature, indeed, to look back upon today, was its undisguised antipathy to the anti-transportation feeling then gathering force throughout southern eastern Australia, and even in Tasmania. The movement was highly unfashionable, say even deeply vulgar, in the leading circles surrounding Government House. For those who had the infirmity of such puritanical leanings, there was an approach to the antipathy, plus contempt, of the southern slaver of the States for his northern abolitionist countrymen. When my friend, Mr. (afterwards Sir) S. A. Donaldson introduced me, for my temporary stay, at the Australian Club, then the high quarters of the party, he passed me a friendly hint to steer clear, at least when on floor of that house, of that delicate subject. This feeling was further and rather amusingly illustrated on one occasion during the separation session, at which I was the member for Melbourne, and present at the time, Mr. Henry Moore, the well-known solicitor and one of the 5 district members, in replying to the charge urged against us of the unfilial indifference or ingratitude of Port Phillip in thus seeking separation, instanced for the contrary the recent event of the arrival from Melbourne of a deputation from the Anti-Transportation League, in order to help Sydney in promoting its good cause. The instant his drift was detected, the Speaker, Dr. Sir Charles Nicholson, apprehensive, doubtless, of some undesirable scene on that too sensational subject, rose to call peremptorily the honourable member to order, and to the non-transgression of his proper subject. But all this injuriously exclusive faction had entirely disappeared from that open and genial society of Sydney, which welcomed Mr. Froude 3 years ago, and which he described so pleasantly. Section 12.